6 armed officers cornered Terence Holloway in a dead-end tunnel. Rifles raised screaming charges he knew were lies. Minutes earlier, he had watched their own lieutenant sell stolen police weapons to a criminal buyer in the dark. No signal, no witnesses, just a wall of guns and a decorated black veteran about to disappear underground forever. Then boots thundered behind him. Red tactical lights swept the walls, and 12 voices he had not heard in years called out his old rank, ordering every one of those officers to stand down. Stay until the end, because the tunnel still hides one betrayal no one saw coming. Belhaven had once been a factory town, and beneath its cracked streets ran a maze of freight tunnels that had carried steel and coal before the mills went quiet. Most of that underground network had been sealed for decades, but a stretch near the North Mercer station had begun to tremble in ways the city's engineers could not explain, and the transit authority sent its safety inspector to find out why. Terence Holloway arrived that afternoon in a reflective jacket carrying a gas meter, a flashlight, and a chest camera he wore out of old habit more than department policy. A clerk at the entrance mentioned almost in passing that police had blocked off part of the tunnel for what she called criminal activity, though no official report had ever reached the transit office. Terence thought little of it at first, since Belhaven's police often used old infrastructure as informal patrol routes. The moment he stepped below the surface, though his instincts told him something did not add up, fresh tire marks cut through undisturbed dust. Gun oil clung to the rim of a metal crate that should have been empty for years. Temporary wiring ran deep into a section marked condemned, and a surveillance camera hung loose from its mount, still warm to the touch. 6 sets of tactical boot prints crossed the floor in patterns too disciplined for scavengers or squatters. Terence had spent enough years reading terrain under fire to recognize a supply route when he saw one, and every sign in front of him pointed to the same conclusion: someone was using this tunnel to move something they did not want. Found. Above ground, Belhaven had spent years trying to convince itself that its worst days were behind it, that the shuttered mills and half-empty blocks were simply waiting for new investment, rather than hiding something far more dangerous underneath. He moved slower after that, running his flashlight along the seams of the wall rather than straight down the corridor, the way he had once been taught to search for pressure plates and buried wire. The air smelled faintly of diesel, where it should have smelled only of rust and standing water, and a fine grit on the ground told him vehicles heavier than a maintenance cart had rolled through recently. Terence noted the details the way he always had, without letting his pulse climb, cataloging evidence the way another man might catalog groceries. Whatever was happening down here had been happening for a while, and it had been happening carefully. He had learned long ago that patience uncovered more truth than fear ever could, and that lesson had never once failed him. He tried to radio the dispatch center, but the signal dissolved into static that had nothing to do with concrete or depth. When he checked his equipment, he realized the interference was too clean, too deliberate, the work of an active jammer, rather than the tunnel's old bones. Rather than turn back, Terence pressed forward to locate the source, moving the way he had once moved through hostile corridors overseas, low and unhurried, letting his ears do more work than his eyes. After rounding a bend slick with condensation, he heard metal striking metal and the low murmur of several voices working in rhythm. Through a gap between 2 steel doors, he saw Lieutenant Bryce Rourke and Sergeant Colton Briggs sorting dozens of police-issue rifles from crates stamped with evidence seals that should never have left a locked property room. A man Terence did not recognize later identified as the broker Victor Dallow handed Rourke a case of cash and asked for the next shipment to include armor-piercing rounds. Terence eased his chest camera into position and let it run, careful to keep his breathing slow and his shadow small against the wall. A soft warning tone chimed inside his earpiece, the battery on his handheld unit dying faster than expected in the damp air, and Briggs's head snapped toward the sound before Terence could silence it. He stepped back instinctively, and his heel caught the edge of a discarded pipe, sending a hollow clang rolling down the corridor like a dropped weapon. Rourke's voice cut through the tunnel with total certainty. "Someone is down here," he said. "Seal every exit." Terence did not panic, because panic had never served him well underground. He killed his flashlight, called up the mental blueprint he had studied before the inspection, and slipped into a narrow maintenance corridor built for pipe access rather than people. Rourke split his men into 3 groups with the calm of a man who had done this before. Briggs would hold the north exit, Mason Tully would cover the pump room, and 2 more officers would try to loop around behind the intruder, while Rourke stayed to destroy evidence and call for reinforcements. Over the radio to headquarters, Rourke reported an armed man attacking officers and fleeing into the condemned tunnel, describing him as dangerous and militarily trained. In under 5 minutes, a transit inspector doing his job became a suspect the entire department was hunting. Terrence tried to push his recorded footage out through the jammed signal, but the interference held firm, so he pulled the memory card from the camera and tucked it into the lining of his glove, trusting his hands more than any network. He led 2 officers away from his real position by rattling an old length of pipe at the far end of a service alcove, careful never to raise a weapon of his own, since he intended to avoid, not provoke a confrontation. For a while, the strategy worked. He kept the distance between himself and the search teams wide enough that their flashlights only ever caught empty corridors, and he used the tunnel's old drainage grooves to muffle his footsteps against the concrete. But he understood the arithmetic of the situation clearly enough. 6 armed men knew this section of tunnel far better than he did, and every minute he spent evading them was a minute Rourke used to rewrite what had actually happened down here into something that would hold up on paper. Rourke, growing impatient for a reason to escalate, ordered Briggs to fire a low-impact round into his own vest and then claimed the inspector had opened fire on police. Mason Tully watched the staged shot from a few yards away, stunned into silence, and when he opened his mouth to object, Briggs warned him that hesitation would make him look like an accomplice instead of an officer. Terrence reached a ventilation control room and found an old, hardwired emergency phone still connected to a dead exchange line from the tunnel's working days. He dialed anyway, more out of instinct than hope, and after a burst of static, a voice answered that made his chest tighten. "This is Dominic Shaw," the voice said. "Who is using this military relay line?" For a moment, Terrence could not speak, recognizing the communications specialist from a unit he had left behind years earlier. Before he could explain, Briggs kicked the control room door off its hinges, and Terrence dove clear of the first shot, yanked a steam valve open, to fill the room with blinding white vapor, and disappeared through a service hatch, while Briggs screamed into his radio that the suspect had assaulted an officer. On the other end of that deadline, Dominic caught only a broken fragment through the noise. "This is Holloway. Belhaven police have taken the tunnel." In a command trailer several blocks away, Dominic turned to Major Silas Crowley and said the name that changed everything that night. "The man in the tunnel is Terrence, sir." A few miles from that trailer, federal agent Lenora Pike had spent 8 months building a case against Victor Dallow, watching him move stolen weapons through Belhaven's underground, with the patience of someone who understood that rushing an operation this size only got good people killed. She had learned that lesson early in her career after a rushed raid cost a young agent his life, and she had carried the memory into every operation since, refusing to let ambition outpace caution no matter how much pressure came from above. Her plan had been simple: wait for Dallow to surface, then take him and the shipment together, but Terrence's unexpected presence tore that plan apart before it could be executed. Silas explained to Pike that Terrence Holloway was not a man given to false alarms or panic, and if he was calling the tunnel compromised by police, the situation had to be far worse than anyone on the surface understood. Within minutes, the reconstituted unit began preparing gear. They had not touched together in years: thermal cameras, a compact reconnaissance, drone ballistic shields, cutting tools for reinforced doors, low-frequency communication sets, a field medical kit that Reuben Holt checked twice out of. Old habit. Pike insisted they hold position until she had clearance, reminding Silas that many of Belhaven's officers might still be innocent, and that a federal team storming a local jurisdiction without authorization could collapse the entire Plokerst case. Silas pushed back hard, certain that if Rourke suspected federal surveillance, he would kill Terrence before evidence could ever be gathered. The argument exposed a history neither man had spoken about in years. On an earlier deployment, Terrence had led his unit out of a tunnel ambush overseas, saving most of the men under his command. But one soldier, Harris Kellen, never made it out, and Terrence had shouldered the blame for that loss so completely that he walked away from the army not long after, refusing every attempt to convince him otherwise. Silas had never accepted that verdict, believing then, and believing now, that Terrence had saved every life that could possibly have been saved that day. He had written letters, left messages, and driven past the small apartment. Terrence kept on the edge of town, more than once, never getting further than the sidewalk before turning back, unwilling to force a conversation. The other man, clearly, was not ready to have. Losing touch with his best soldier had never sat right with him. And now, with Terrence's voice crackling through a compromised radio line somewhere beneath the city, that old, unfinished guilt resurfaced alongside a sharper, more immediate fear. Inside the tunnel, Rourke's voice crackled through a handheld speaker, ordering Terrence Holloway to surrender for assaulting a police officer, stealing evidence and endangering city infrastructure, and demanding he step forward with his prider. Hands raised, Terrence answered from the darkness that his camera had already captured the weapons exchange, and Rourke immediately twisted the accusation, suggesting the veteran was suffering some kind of mental breakdown tied to his military service, weaponizing Terrence's own past against him in real time. Terrence understood then that Rourke had access to his personnel file, which meant this operation reached higher than one corrupt lieutenant working alone. Back at the command trailer, Dominic managed to recover 3 seconds of salvaged footage from Terrence's transmission, just enough to show Rourke standing beside the crates of stolen rifles, and Pike used it immediately to request emergency authorization to intervene. While she waited for approval to move, Rourke ordered a section of old demolition charges near the collapsed platform, activated, intending to bring down a portion of the tunnel, kill Terrence in the process, and later claimed the veteran had triggered a structural failure while resisting arrest. Wesley Knox, monitoring thermal readings from the drone feed, noticed a dangerous heat signature building around several support columns and gave the warning that finally pushed the unit toward the tunnel entrance. "They are not just hunting Terrence," he said. "They are about to bury everyone down there alive." Terrence found a moment of stillness in an old storage room and pressed a hand against the shoulder wound. A chunk of falling concrete had opened earlier, aware that hiding would only delay the inevitable, and that if the tunnel came down, his only proof of the weapons deal would vanish, along with everything else. He decided to double back toward the trading area, to retrieve the shipment logs and serial records that would corroborate what his camera had already captured. Victor Dallow, growing anxious about the growing police presence, demanded Rourke get him out before federal agents arrived. But Rourke refused and told Briggs to hold Dallow instead, quietly intending to eliminate the broker along with every other loose end before the night was through. Mason Tully began to understand with a chill settling in his stomach that Rourke had never planned for anyone in that tunnel to walk out alive. Moving through the old ventilation shafts, Terrence made it back to the storage area and gathered a list of missing weapon shipments, an 8-month delivery schedule, the identification numbers of police vehicles used to transport the guns, and a small recorder that captured a conversation between Rourke and someone who was never named directly, only referred to by a mysterious title. Before Terrence could leave, Mason found him and raised his weapon more out of fear than conviction. Terrence did not fight him. Instead, he asked Mason to look at the crates behind him and consider why Rourke needed the entire tunnel destroyed rather than simply arresting one inspector. Mason wavered, but still demanded the memory card, and Terrence handed him a decoy instead, watching him retreat and report back that the evidence had been secured. Mason had joined the department 3 years earlier, believing the badge meant something, and every order Rourke gave that night chipped away at whatever certainty he had once carried about what kind of officer he wanted to be. Handing off the false card felt for a moment like doing the right thing, like proof he still had some say in how this night ended. Rourke crushed the false card without hesitation, then quietly told Briggs to eliminate Mason once the situation resolved. since he had seen far too much to be trusted. Terrence continued, moving only to be ambushed at a steel stairwell where Briggs shot out the overhead lights and plunged the corridor into darkness. What followed was a close, brutal struggle, and though Terrence had every opportunity to end it permanently, he chose instead to lock Briggs against the railing and strip his radio, unwilling to become the kind of man Rourke was trying to paint him as. Over the police channel, Terrence broadcast a warning to every officer still listening. "Any of you still loyal to that badge need to get out of this tunnel now," he said. "Rourke is planning to kill all of you before this is over." A handful of officers on the surface began exchanging uneasy glances, but before the message could spread further, Elaine Harrow Belhaven's police chief arrived at the surface command post and ordered every open channel cut, then gave Rourke full authority to handle what she called the threat below without interference. Agent Pike, listening from her own frequency, realized in that instant that this conspiracy went far beyond one corrupt lieutenant working in the shadows. Rourke gathered his most loyal officers and pushed Terrence toward the eastern maintenance corridor, a dead end sealed by a welded steel gate that offered no way through. Terrence, realizing he was being funneled into a trap, deliberately left a trail of false signs to pull the pursuing officers away from the section rigged, with explosives buying time for people he did not yet know were coming. Mason quietly disabled one of the signal jammers, creating a window of barely a minute. And in that gap, Terrence managed to transmit coordinates and a fragment of recorded audio to Dominic before the signal collapsed again. Briggs caught Mason in the act and struck him to the ground, and Rourke tore the weapon from his hands, declaring him a traitor to the badge in front of the others. At the dead end, Terrence tried the old gate controls, but the power had long since been cut, leaving him with nowhere left to run. 6 officers emerged from the darkness behind him. Rourke at the center, Briggs limping but armed, 4 more spread wide on either side, and Mason held roughly at the rear. Rourke ordered Terrence to his knees. Terrence raised his hands but refused to kneel instead, demanding the officers behind Rourke inspect the weapons crates before following any order to fire. Rourke accused him of assaulting police, stealing evidence, and damaging city property, but Terrence calmly dismantled every claim he had entered. Unarmed, the bullet wound on Briggs's vest came from a distance too close to be real. The comes it of the Terrence Ender Every to the daughter. Entrance camera would confirm exactly when he arrived. No officer had ever called for medical support, and the explosives had been planted long before he ever set foot underground. The silence that followed Terrence's words stretched longer than Rourke could afford, and he could see it settling on the faces around him, doubt creeping in, where blind obedience had stood only minutes before. One of the 4 surrounding officers began almost imperceptibly to lower his weapon, and Rourke fired a warning shot into the wall beside him, snapping that Terrence was manipulating them all. The sound of the shot echoed down the corridor for what felt like a full minute, and in that ringing silence, nobody moved, nobody spoke, and nobody quite believed anymore that Rourke was in full control of the men he commanded. In the silence that followed, Terrence heard a faint sound through the sealed gate behind him. 3 knocks, a pause, then 2 more. The exact signal his old unit had used to identify itself in hostile territory for years. For a fraction of a second, something in his chest loosened that had been clenched tight since the moment he first saw the crates of stolen rifles. He understood help had arrived, but could not yet break through, so he kept talking, kept stalling, kept Rourke's attention fixed on him instead of the gate. Rourke began counting down from 5, ordering Terrence to lie flat on the ground, and by the count of 2, red tactical light spilled through the seams of the steel door behind him. A controlled charge detonated, and the gate tore free of its frame in a burst of sound and dust. 12 members of a federal tactical team surged through behind Terrence, weapons lowered but ready, and Silas Crowley stepped forward, locking eyes with Rourke. "You are pointing a weapon at First Sergeant Terrence Holloway," he said. "Lower it now." Rourke refused, yanking Mason in front of him as a shield and reaching for the detonator strapped to his vest, and the standoff that followed pulled everyone in the corridor into a single held breath. Because Mason was being used as a shield, Silas's team could not risk opening fire, so Rourke retreated into a side passage, dragging Mason with him, while Briggs laid down cover fire to slow their pursuit. Terrence shifted instantly from hunted man to guide, warning Silas that the entire western section of tunnel had been rigged with explosives and that any pursuit needed to account for it. Silas handed Terrence his old tactical radio and said simply that he knew this tunnel better than anyone alive and asked him to lead them out. The words echoed a mission from years earlier. And for a moment, Terrence hesitated, but this time he did not turn away from the responsibility. The unit split into 3 coordinated elements. Silas and Terrence pursued Rourke directly. Jonah Creed and Wesley Knox worked to disarm the explosives. Reuben Holt moved to treat wounded officers on both sides of the conflict. Agent Pike led federal agents to secure the weapons cache, and Preston Vale covered every surface exit from a rooftop position. Briggs ambushed the pursuing team near the pump station, firing into a fuel line and setting a wall of flame across the corridor to block their path. Heat rolled off the flames in waves that pushed the whole team back several yards, and for a moment, it seemed the fire alone might succeed where Briggs's bullets had failed. Terrence remembered an old drainage channel running beneath the main floor and directed Garrett Boone to pry open a service grate, allowing the team to bypass the fire entirely. They dropped one by one into the narrow channel, moving in a crouched line through water that reeked of decades of neglect until they emerged on the far side of the pump station, coughing but unhurt. Meanwhile, Rourke forced Mason to lead him toward a hidden exit, and Mason, still bleeding from Briggs's earlier attack, deliberately steered them the wrong way to buy more time. Rourke realized the deception and shot Mason in the leg without hesitation, leaving him behind as he pushed forward alone. Terrence and Silas found Mason moments later, and while Reuben worked to stabilize him, Terrence asked where Rourke had gone. Mason revealed that Rourke was carrying a detonator and a data drive containing the names of everyone involved in the trafficking network information that could bring the entire operation down if it reached federal hands intact. Terrence wanted to press forward immediately, but Silas urged him to let the federal team handle the pursuit from here, and the two argued briefly before Silas relented, agreeing to let Terrence lead as long as he did not break from the group. Again, they found Briggs holed up in a machine room, and he mocked Terrence, claiming that no matter what happened tonight, the city would always believe the word of police officers over a black veteran already painted as violent. He had heard versions of that same sentence before in different rooms from different men, and it had never once made him doubt himself the way Briggs seemed to expect. Terrence refused to let the taunt shake him instead, cutting the lights and sealing every exit until Briggs had no choice but to surrender. Pike arrived to cuff him in front of the tactical team's cameras, making certain there would be no way to twist the story later, and as officers led him away, Briggs let one detail slip. Rourke had never given the original order. Someone on the surface had known the exact moment Terrence would be sent down into that tunnel. Terrence realized then that his inspection had never been a coincidence, and that someone had engineered the entire encounter to turn him into a scapegoat before the night even began. Back at the makeshift command post, Pike reviewed the data Terrence had recovered and found a recurring reference in one recording to a contact identified only by the code name Harbor, someone Rourke reported to regularly throughout the Terrence operation. Dominic ran a voice comparison and found the match unmistakable. Harbor was Elaine Harrow. It was Harrow who had quietly altered the transit inspection schedule, ensuring Terrence would walk into the tunnel at the precise moment the weapons exchange was taking place, intending for him to stumble upon planted evidence that Rourke could then use to arrest him for theft, using his military background and guarded personal history to paint him as an unstable veteran chasing weapons of his own. Harrow had run Belhaven's police department for 11 years, and in that time she had learned exactly how far the city's trust could be stretched before anyone thought to question it. She had built her reputation on order and results, and the network beneath her command had quietly funded much of the political capital that kept her in office, a debt she had no intention of ever repaying in public. That plan collapsed the moment Terrence arrived early and witnessed the actual transaction, forcing Harrow's carefully staged frame-up into something far more desperate and lethal. On the surface, Harrow ordered a full lockdown of the surrounding blocks, citing an armed threat underground, quietly preparing to collapse the tunnel and let Terrence take the blame for the destruction. Pike pushed for emergency authority to strip Harrow of command, but the process moved slower than the danger warranted. And inside the tunnel, the detonator's countdown had already dropped to 18 minutes. Jonah discovered that the explosive charges were not simply meant to destroy the weapons cache. They had been placed dangerously close to the city's main gas line, and a detonation strong enough would threaten several commercial blocks. On the surface above, Terrence guessed that Rourke was heading toward an old control station capable of remotely triggering the gas valves, and Silas ordered the team to evacuate immediately, but Terrence refused, arguing that the tunnel could never be considered secure as long as the detonator remained in Rourke's places on hands. He, Silas, and Garrett continued the pursuit while the rest of the unit worked to clear the area. Rourke radioed Harrow, demanding a vehicle and an escape route, but Harrow refused outright, telling him bluntly that he had become a liability she no longer intended to protect. He had spent years covering for her, taking risks she never had to touch, and hearing the flat indifference in her voice now stripped away any illusion that their arrangement had ever been anything close to loyalty. Rourke understood in that moment that Harrow was prepared to let him die underground rather than risk exposure herself, and fury replaced whatever loyalty had once kept him following her orders. He decided that if he was going down, the entire operation would go down, with him threatening to detonate every charge in the tunnel and release every piece of incriminating data to whoever would listen. Terrence, overhearing the call, tried to reason with him, pointing out that Harrow had used him and was ready to abandon him without a second thought. Rourke answered coldly that he would rather bury the whole city than spend the rest of his life in a cell. Moments later, alarms began shrieking through the tunnel as Rourke opened the main gas valve, and flammable vapor began seeping into the lower corridors, turning every spark into a potential catastrophe. The smell reached the team before the alarms did a faint sweetness under the damp concrete air that every one of them recognized instantly, and Reuben immediately began handing out respirator masks, pulled from the medical kit, his hands steady, even as his voice carried a new urgency. With gas filling the air, Pike ordered every weapon in the tunnel holstered, since a single stray shot could ignite the entire system. Terrence led Silas and Garrett through a narrow maintenance passage toward the control room, the tight walls and dim light echoing uncomfortably close to the tunnel, where Harris Kellen had died years earlier. The sound, the darkness, and the metallic smell pulled Terrence's focus away from the present, and his pace slowed as old grief resurfaced with startling force. Silas caught the shift immediately and reminded him that Harris had died to an explosive device no one could have detected in time, not because Terrence had failed him. For the first time, Terrence admitted aloud that he had spent years avoiding his old unit, because every time he looked at them, all he could see was the one man who never made it home. Silas answered simply that they had not come looking for him to remind him of who they lost, but because they were still here, still alive, and still his to lead if he would let them. Something in Terrence steadied at those words, and his focus sharpened as they closed in on the control room. Inside, Rourke stood with the detonator on a table beside him, holding Victor Dallow, who had escaped temporary custody only to be recaptured as a human shield. Rourke demanded transportation immunity and a guaranteed escape, and Pike stretched the negotiation out over the radio, buying every second she could. Terrence noticed a ventilation system running directly above Rourke's position and asked Wesley to reverse the fan direction, sending a sudden burst of noise and rattling metal through the room as a distraction. Garrett slipped through the ductwork above Silas, advanced from the main door, and Terrence circled through a lower access panel, converging on Rourke from 3 directions at once. In the chaos, Dallow tore free of Rourke's grip, and though Rourke nearly dropped the detonator in the struggle, he snatched it back before it hit the floor. Terrence reached him first, and the two collided on the steel floor in a brutal close-quarters struggle, made more dangerous by the fact that neither side could risk a gunshot in air thick with gas. Rourke struck the old wound on Terrence's shoulder, nearly sending him over the edge of an open ventilation shaft, and taunted him, insisting the city would never believe him over sworn police officers. Terrence answered, without hesitation, that he did not need anyone to believe him, because the camera on Silas's vest, already broadcasting live to Federal Command, would tell the truth for him. Panic flashed across Rourke's face, and he lunged for the detonator's trigger, but Terrence seized his wrist in the final second, allowing Silas to pin him to the floor, while Garrett wrenched the device from his hand. For one brief moment, everyone in the room believed the danger had passed, and Reuben moved forward to check on Dallow, who sat trembling against the wall, while Garrett secured Rourke's wrists with a length of cable pulled from a nearby panel. Yet the countdown on the wall kept running. Rourke laughed through the pain, revealing that the device they had just taken was only a secondary controller and that the true detonator sat above ground inside Chief Harrow's own command vehicle. With less than 4 minutes remaining, Dominic traced the primary trigger signal directly to Harrow's car, and Pike immediately ordered surface units to intercept it before it could disappear into the city. Harrow drove straight through a police barricade, insisting over the radio that she was pursuing an armed suspect, while Preston Vale watched helplessly from a nearby rooftop, unable to take a shot without risking an automatic detonation if the signal cut out unexpectedly. Terrence proposed the only viable option left, not severing the signal but redirecting it toward a decoy receiver before the timer expired. Dominic needed an authentication code stored on Rourke's locked data drive to make the redirection work, and Rourke, still defiant, refused to cooperate until Terrence reminded him that Harrow had already prepared a file, placing full blame for the entire network on his shoulders alone. Faced with the reality that Harrow intended to let him fall completely, Rourke finally surrendered the code. Dominic built a decoy receiver in seconds, but it needed to come within a few dozen yards of Harrow's vehicle to intercept the true signal in time. Wesley launched a drone carrying the decoy device to chase down the car, but Harrow spotted it and swerved deliberately toward an underpass, hoping to disrupt the transmission entirely. Every second mattered now, and the entire team could hear the countdown ticking through their headsets, a steady mechanical pulse that made the whole night feel like it was collapsing toward one narrow point. With barely a minute left on the countdown, the first drone clipped a road sign and spun out of control. But Garrett redirected a backup unit from another angle just in time. Dominic completed the signal redirection, with only seconds remaining, tricking the explosive charges into a dormant standby state instead of detonation. And Jonah's team immediately moved to strip the triggering mechanisms entirely, securing the tunnel for good. Harrow's vehicle was finally boxed in by federal units near the Bellhaven Bridge overpass, and she stepped out, still attempting to invoke her authority as chief, ordering bystanders to clear the area as though nothing had changed. Agent Pike arrived with a federal warrant already prepared, and Harrow accused Terrence of terrorism while claiming Pike was sabotaging a legitimate local investigation. In response, Pike played the live footage for every officer gathered at the Surface Command Post, showing Rourke negotiating stolen weapons on Briggs, staging a false crime scene Harrow, ordering the tunnel destroyed with people still inside. Terrence repeatedly refusing to use lethal force even when cornered, and his old unit working to save wounded officers as readily as they worked to save him. One by one, the officers who had spent the night hunting Terrence lowered their weapons and stepped away from Harrow without a word. Pike placed her in handcuffs in front of the entire command post, and Terrence emerged from underground alongside Silas and the rest of his unit, while dozens of officers who had chased him only hours earlier could not bring themselves to meet his eyes. Just as everyone assumed the ordeal had ended, Mason asked to speak with Terrence privately, and revealed that one final crate of weapons had never been recovered from the tunnel at all. According to Mason, that shipment had been moved to a transit authority storage facility before Terrence had even been sent underground, which meant someone inside his own agency had helped set the entire trap in motion. Pike turned her investigation toward Terrence's direct supervisor, Safety Director Warren Dalka, a man who had seemed genuinely concerned when he assigned Terrence to the inspection, but who had in truth been receiving payments from the trafficking network for months. Dalka had chosen Terrence deliberately for reasons that became clearer with every piece of evidence uncovered. He had legitimate access to the tunnel. His military history could easily be twisted into a narrative of instability, and his isolated personal life meant few people would question his story if he simply disappeared, leaving investigators to close the case as nothing more than a troubled veteran who lost control underground. It was a betrayal that stung in a different way than the others because Dalka had shaken Terrence's hand on his first day at the Transit Authority and had spent 2 years asking after his health, his shoulder, his adjustment to civilian life, all while quietly deciding when the moment would come to use him. Pike and a federal team raided the storage facility and recovered the final shipment of weapons just as Dalka attempted to burn the last of his paperwork. Rourke, Briggs, Harrow, Dalka, and Dallow were charged with a long list of crimes, including weapons trafficking, theft of evidence, conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of a federal investigation, staging false evidence, abuse of official power, and endangering public safety through unauthorized explosives. Mason received treatment for his injuries and agreed to testify against the network. And while he could never be called a hero, given his role in the earlier cover-up, his testimony proved essential in confirming the full scope of the conspiracy, and he understood he would still have to answer for his own choices that night. Families who had spent years insisting a relative's conviction did not add up finally found investigators willing to listen, and reporters who had once printed Rourke's version of events without question began asking harder questions about how long the department had looked the other way. The Belhaven Police Department was placed under independent oversight, and many of the arrests made by Rourke's unit over the preceding years were reopened for review. Terrence was publicly cleared of every charge brought against him, but he declined the city's offer of a formal ceremony, unwilling to let officials turn what had happened into a polished public relations moment. He agreed only to a quiet gathering with his old unit, away from cameras and speeches. In a small, unremarkable room, Silas set his old service insignia on the table in front of him, the same one he had kept safe for years, without ever being asked to return it. Terrence said quietly that he was not the same soldier they remembered from before. Silas answered that inside that tunnel, Terrence had done exactly what he had always done. Protected the innocent, stayed steady while surrounded, refused to leave anyone behind, valued the truth over his own safety, and led the people around him out of the dark. Terrence finally admitted for the first time in years that he could no longer keep living as though he had died alongside Harris Kellen that day. He told them quietly that he had built an entire life out of staying at a distance, out of never letting anyone close enough to need him again, and that the tunnel had shown him just how much that distance had cost him without his ever noticing. None of the men in that room offered him forgiveness because none of them believed he needed it, and instead, they simply let the words sit in the air until the weight of them settled somewhere easier to carry. Pike offered him a position as a tactical advisor for underground rescue and combat operations with the federal team, and though he gave her no immediate answer, he reached out and took the insignia back from Silas's hand. Weeks later, Terrence stood once more at the entrance to the Belhaven tunnel, now sealed off pending further investigation, with Silas, Jonah Preston, Dominic, Reuben Wesley, and Garrett gathered beside him. For the first time in years, Terrence did not stand apart from them. The sky above the tunnel entrance had turned the pale gray of early evening, and for a while nobody spoke, each of them simply standing in the quiet, the way soldiers do when a long mission has finally truly ended. As the group turned to leave, Silas called out to him, using the old rank one final time. "First Sergeant Holloway," he said. Terrence stopped and turned back. "Are you coming with us?" Silas asked. Terrence looked once more at the darkened entrance behind him, then at the men waiting ahead and stepped forward to join them. This time he said, "I am not walking alone." The police had cornered Terrence Holloway in the darkness, believing no one would ever hear his side of the story. They were wrong. The men behind him had followed his voice through fire once before, and when the tunnel closed around him again, they came back to make certain their brother finally walked into the light with them.